Story 1. The Curse of Hollow Creek. The town of Hollow Creek had long been abandoned, its ruins swallowed by the surrounding forest. The official story was that a fire had wiped out the town decades ago, but locals whispered a darker truth. Something had driven the people away, something evil. James Thornton never believed in ghost stories. As a documentary filmmaker, he had spent years debunking paranormal myths. When he heard about Hollow Creek, he saw it as just another project, an abandoned town with a fabricated legend. He packed his camera, flashlight, and notebook, then set off alone into the woods. The trail was overgrown, nearly invisible beneath layers of dead leaves. The deeper he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him. A strange silence filled the air. No birds, no rustling branches. Just an eerie, suffocating stillness. After an hour, he found the ruins. Crumbling buildings stood like skeletons, their wooden frames blackened with age. In the center of town stood the old chapel, its bell tower leaning dangerously to one side. Something about it made James uneasy. As he stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Dust swirled in the weak sunlight filtering through shattered stained glass windows. The wooden pews were overturned, the altar broken. But the most disturbing part was the symbol carved into the floor, a massive, intricate sigil drawn in deep, blackened grooves. James knelt beside it, brushing away debris. The lines pulsed faintly, almost as if they were alive. He took out his camera and snapped a photo. Then a whisper, faint, like a breath against his ear. He turned sharply. Nothing. Just the ruins, silent as before. Shaking it off, he stepped back to take another picture. But when he looked through the viewfinder, a figure stood in the doorway. James froze. A tall, shadowy figure, its face obscured by darkness, watched him. Its body flickered, like a flame struggling against the wind. He dropped his camera and spun around. The doorway was empty. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He grabbed his camera, but when he checked the footage, the figure was gone. Just an empty doorway. His rational mind fought against the growing dread. It was a trick of the light, nothing more. He took a deep breath and turned back to the sigil. But now the grooves were filled with something wet, something dark, blood. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the chapel, vibrating the walls. The symbol on the floor began to glow. James stumbled backward as the air turned thick and heavy. Shadows stretched unnaturally, creeping toward him. The whispering returned, now surrounding him, voices overlapping in an unholy chant. He ran, out of the chapel, through the ruins, into the trees. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he didn't stop. The whispering followed, growing louder, sharper, until it wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. Then, silence. James collapsed, gasping for breath. When he looked up, he was back on the main road, the ruins of Hollow Creek nowhere in sight. Had he imagined it? A hallucination? Shaking, he reached for his camera. The screen was cracked, but the last image was still visible. The sigil, glowing, shifting, and a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him. Then, beneath the image, burned into the screen itself, was a single word. Marked. James felt a searing pain in his palm. He turned it over. The sigil was there, carved into his flesh. And from the shadows behind him, the whispering began again. Story 2. The Silent Ones. The town of Blackwood had a secret. For centuries, it had stood in the shadow of the forest, untouched by time. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did never stayed long. Some claimed it was the eerie silence, the way the birds refused to sing, the way the wind never howled. But the truth was something far worse. Elias Grayson had never feared the unknown. As a historian, he had spent years researching forgotten towns, but Blackwood was different. There were no records, no official maps, just whispers in old books about the Silent Ones. He dismissed the legends as superstition and set out to uncover the truth. The road to Blackwood was overgrown, the asphalt cracked and broken. As Elias drove deeper into the woods, an unnatural fog rolled in, thick and suffocating. His headlights barely cut through it, and the farther he went, the more he felt like something was watching. Finally, the town emerged through the mist, perfectly preserved. The buildings stood untouched, windows unbroken, as if abandoned just yesterday. Yet, there were no signs of life. No people, no movement. Just an unnatural stillness that sent a chill through Elias's spine. He stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, charged with something unseen. He pulled out his camera and started recording. Then he saw them. Figures standing in the windows, watching him. Motionless, faceless. Elias blinked. The windows were empty. His breath hitched. Was his mind playing tricks on him? He shook it off and walked toward the town square. A large stone fountain stood at its center, dry and cracked with age. In front of it lay a massive circular symbol etched into the ground. The design was intricate, spiraling outward in jagged, chaotic lines. He knelt, tracing a finger over it. Whispers filled the air. Not from behind him, not from the buildings, from beneath him. Elias shot to his feet, his pulse hammering. The ground beneath the symbol shifted, as if something underneath was stirring. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, surrounding him. He turned. The figures were back. No faces, no eyes, just empty voids where features should be. They stood in the doorways, the alleyways, the streets, hundreds of them, perfectly still, heads slightly tilted. Elias took a step back. They moved, not by walking. They just shifted. 1 second they were distant. The next, they were closer. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him. His body froze, his mind screaming to run, but he couldn't move. Then the ground cracked open. A hand, long, skeletal, black as shadow, reached out from the symbol, grasping the air. Another followed. Elias finally broke free from his paralysis and turned to run. A hand clamped over his mouth, not physical, not warm, cold, hollow, not human. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was the figures stepping forward, their mouths opening, not to speak, but to consume. The whispers became screams. Then, silence. The next day, his car was found on the edge of the forest, engine running, driver's side door open. But Elias Grayson was never seen again, and the town of Blackwood remained, waiting for the next visitor, waiting for you.